Alright, YouTube, this is sort of an urgent update because this needs to be spread around in some form as quickly as possible. The mainstream media, and there are two articles in the description, the first from CNN, the second from the New York Times, CNN representing the sort of administration-friendly news outlet of choice for the Obama administration. Right now they are shilling for war with Syria under the guise of this particular article that talks about how pictures and reports from Syria are showing that the Assad regime is executing thousands of prisoners. The second article is from the New York Times 3 days ago, which references the UN and the same wartimes forensic experts that the CNN article references. Only the New York Times article clearly states that their conclusion was that the Syrian rebels were executing prisoners, that these perhaps 10,000 dead individuals were dead because they had been held prisoner by the rebels. The rebels were forced to flee several of their strategic locations, and as a result, they're obviously not going to tote prisoners along with them. So they hung them, shot them, burned them, whatever, as they were fleeing. So right now what seems to be the case is that after their former failure, of course, Kerry and Obama and everyone else came out with the chemical weapons reports from Syria and said, well, we're asking for limited strikes. Nobody was taken in. Everyone knew that if we struck so much as lobbed a grenade into Syria, we'd end up invading on the ground. Everyone knew that. It's clear that that's what they wanted. And they failed. The American public was deeply, and still is deeply, against intervening in Syria. You'd probably have a higher ratio of people supporting it if we wanted to go to war with North Korea than to go to war with Syria. People are tired of Middle Eastern conflicts. They're tired of getting involved with the sectarian bickering. And frankly, because of the internet being as interconnected as it is, most people understand that the Syrian rebels, who our government to this day is continuing to fund, are backed by the Al-Qaeda, essentially, which is in turn backed by the Saudi Arabians, which is in turn backed by Israel in some cases, that these are Al-Qaeda fighters, most of them aren't even Syrian, that the Syrian people largely just want the fighting to stop. People understand that because, of course, we haven't quite gotten rid of all fair reporting on the internet, and it's not yet censored as much as the government would wish it would be. And you can look to Saudi Arabia as the cause of this specific reporting. Of course, the Saudi Arabians, I pointed out on my former video about the Sochi Olympics, which is loosely tied into this. The Saudi Arabians are the ones funding these rebel groups largely, because the Saudi Arabians want a pipeline through Syria. And it's not possible to do that as long as Assad is holding power. The Saudis don't like the Russians. The Russians have always interfered in their plans. There's a little bit of retaliatory vengeance in it for them on a historical level. The Saudis dislike the Syrians and Iranians. Why do you think the US, which gets all the Saudi oil, why do you think we continually try to go to war with these people? The idea, and there was another story about Iran will have nukes in 2 or 3 weeks. No, they won't. They've been saying since the fucking 1980s, oh, Iran is a year away. Iran is mere months away. Iran could get a nuke at any time. They've been saying it for decades, and it has never happened. They're barely ahead of where they were to begin with in the 80s. They're never going to achieve a true weaponized nuke. They're never going to fit a warhead on a missile that's capable of going anywhere. It's the same as in North Korea, only they're further behind. The same holds true with Syria. There was never evidence that Assad gassed his own people. It would have been ludicrous for him to have done so, because once the international community, by the way, the UN investigated that too and said, no, we can't determine who fired it. We know it was used. We know that nerve gas was used. Can you tell who shot it? No. And had we allowed Obama and Kerry to strike, we never would have known that till we were already on the ground in Syria, which is what they wanted. Obama and Kerry and all the others get support from the Saudis. It's clear. This isn't by the way, this has nothing to do with, oh, well, Obama's actually Muslim. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying the Saudi government has interfered traditionally in American politics. It does this in two ways. Number one, it sells discounted oil to the Western world, which everyone likes. If they were to suddenly shut it off to try to blackmail us, our gas prices would skyrocket. That wouldn't be good. We'd be forced to either go to war with them to resecure the oil or do what they say. Number two, they send terrorists in. The 9/11 hijackers were largely Saudi Arabians. They were trained by Saudi Arabians. They were funded by the Saudi government. It has now been revealed that that is the case. And when that finally comes out fully, which hopefully it will, people in this country will be shocked. But the Saudis are the ones that stand to gain the most should Assad be kicked out of power. Though right now they're worried because even though the United States is already giving small arms training and money to the Syrian rebels, it's not working. Assad is still winning. Well, the Saudis are tired of Assad. He's an Alawite. He's not a Sunni. He doesn't play well with the Saudis. They are a Sunni nation. And one thing, people need to understand this once and for all. There is a difference, a very large difference between groups like the Alawite and the general Shiite minority and the Sunnis. The Saudis are Sunni. Iraq is run now by Shiites, although before it was run by Sunnis, by Ba'athist party members. It's actually very strange that we put the Shias in power in Iraq. Iran is a Shiite nation. Syria is a Shiite nation. Lebanon is a Shiite nation. Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Turkey and so forth are Sunni nations. And we, for some reason, have decided to side with the Sunnis, despite the fact that they're the ones that are more authoritarian. They take their religion extremely seriously. They're the ones that oppress women largely. And with the exception, again, as I said before, of Turkey and Tunisia, you don't find many Sunni nations that are any good. Not that Iran or Syria are much better, but they were more stable before. That's the way it has traditionally been. But our government wants to go in there. You can bet that when Saudi Arabia told Putin, oh, well, we can control the Chechens as long as you get rid of Syria, get rid of Assad, and he said no. What did they then do? And I'm sure that in some point in the future we'll know this. I think that the next thing that the Saudi government did is go to the United States, the other nation capable of dealing with the situation without mass casualties, and said, well, okay, Putin said no, we'll ask the United States. And I think at first the United States said no, and I think the Saudis said, okay, well, we can arrange for something to change your mind. And I think that's the reason that this happened. In fact, you could almost say that 9/11 might have been orchestrated primarily at the behest of the Saudi government, which obviously knew what Osama was doing. They control most of these al-Qaeda militants in the first place, which is something people don't understand. What other reason? It's obvious that the reason wasn't they hate our freedoms. It's obvious that the reason wasn't they're suicidal and they want us to invade Afghanistan, at least the al-Qaeda members. No, the Saudis would like it if we invaded Iraq, because then we could kick out people who weren't playing nice with the Saudis and were trying to build pipelines that would bypass them and compete with their oil markets. Specifically, if they went through Iran, that would be a huge problem because it would cut them off at the Indian Ocean. This is geopolitics. It's the strategy of the Middle East. All these nations want to have access to the oil and they want the pipelines and so forth. And Israel isn't too fond of Syria either because they support Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, of course, bickers with Israel on a constant basis. So who is ultimately to blame here is up in the air. But what is clear here is that CNN and the mainstream media, by virtue, you can look at the links, look at the one that is older and says quite clearly the UN determined that the rebels were the ones mass executing prisoners. CNN comes out of nowhere, using the same damn story, the same report, only saying that it's Assad that's responsible. Well, no, the UN and these watchdogs determined the rebels executed thousands of prisoners as they fled. It had nothing to do with Assad. It had to do with these al-Qaeda-backed rebels, the same ones that the United States is funding and giving weapons to. That is the real reason why you see these so-called gruesome pictures, although they're no worse than anything that came out of post-invasion Iraq after Bush decided he wanted a new strategy to keep Saddam from getting nuclear weapons. It's ridiculous that the mainstream media is doing this, but thankfully, I think we dodged the bullet again on having to send our own troops over to die. And I think Assad dodged the propaganda bullet again, because if you look at the comments, the majority of them are saying essentially for Obama and Kerry and CNN to shove it up their ass. And that they're tired of war, again, which they should know by now. People are tired of the fighting. They're tired of wars in the Middle East. They're tired of what appears to be quite obvious propaganda against Assad and against the Syrians. Not saying Assad's a great guy. He seems like an interesting person, but yes, he is a bit murderous. But then again, he is charged with protecting the Alawite minority in a nation that has been run in such a way that the Sunnis were not able to make it essentially a vassal of Saudi Arabia. He's trying to maintain the independence of Syria, its ability to perform trade and military maneuvers, not at the behest of the Meccans, essentially. And he's facing many obstacles to doing so because Saudi Arabia and the United States now are arming and training these rebels that are operating in his country, most of which, again, as I've said many times, are not themselves Syrian citizens. This is not a popular uprising. These are groups of Libyans and Iraqis and Saudis and Jordanians and Lebanese individuals who are working for Saudi Arabia. They're getting paid by the Saudis. Essentially, they're getting promised that parts of Syria, and this is the long-term goal of Al-Qaeda and all of these groups, a chunk of southeast Turkey, northern Iraq, and northern Syria to become an Al-Qaeda-led Islamic Caliph state. They've even said that this is their goal. They've admitted it openly. Just the same as the Saudis have openly admitted they control the Chechen terrorists in Russia that are trying to go after the Sochi Olympics. It's as simple as that. And the U.S. has no place getting involved here. If anything, if the United States is smart and it doesn't want to stay out of it, it will back Assad and try to rip it out of Russian hands and say to Assad, well, we're sorry that the mainstream media and the president have constantly tried to overthrow you. Here's some money and guns. Go take care of these Saudis. And then we would turn around and say to the Saudis to go fuck themselves and promise to invade if they ever fool with the oil prices. It would be a little bit more interesting if the Western world were to do so, and they wouldn't exactly be able to stand up to such an assault. That's about all. Keep your mind clean of this propaganda, because that's exactly what it is. Essentially, they're, trying to blame Assad for what the rebels, the UN, clearly said they actually did themselves. Keep it clean of such propaganda. Don't believe everything you read in the news, because a lot of it's a bunch of bullshit. You need to cross-check it, apparently, with other sources. That's about all. Peace out.